The day Karen called the cops on us over a so-called porch permit violation was the day she signed her own resignation letter. She just didn't know it yet. See, to her, we were just another couple in a cozy lakeside cabin, easy targets for her petty HOA power trips. She had no idea my wife wasn't just a quiet, book-loving woman who baked pies on weekends. She was a sitting federal judge with a long memory and zero tolerance for abuse of authority. What started as a bogus $75 fine for a missing permit turned into a full-blown legal reckoning that would shake our entire community. So if you've ever been bullied by someone hiding behind rules they barely understand, stick around, because this is the story of how one phone call to the cops brought an entire HOA empire crumbling down. There's something sacred about silence, especially the kind you find near a still lake, tucked between trees older than the town itself. That's what drew us here. My wife and I didn't want a mansion or a boat dock with champagne brunches. We just wanted peace, a place to breathe again. After 2 decades in the city, working long hours, me in logistics consulting and my wife in the justice system, we were both burnt out, especially her. Being a federal judge is like being the eye of a hurricane. From the outside, it looks calm and steady. But inside, it's all motion, pressure, and unrelenting attention. Even off the bench, she never really got to stop thinking about the law, about precedent, about the weight of her words. I always admired her ability to carry that pressure, but even she had limits. So when we found the cabin listing, a cedar-shingled one-story tucked on the east side of Lake Bellamy, just outside city limits, we didn't hesitate. It wasn't luxurious. No granite countertops or cathedral ceilings. But it had a wraparound porch, tall pines, and enough quiet to hear yourself think. And after all the noise we'd endured, that was enough. We bought it under a modest LLC. Not to be secretive, but because anonymity offered a kind of peace of its own. No titles, no attention. Just the two of us, our dog Clementine, and the water. The neighbors seemed nice enough. Most of them waved as we passed, and no one asked too many questions. That was perfect. We came up on weekends, sometimes staying into Monday. We'd hike the trails, roast marshmallows over our fire pit, and drink coffee on the porch while the sun crept up over the tree line. Then Karen Wellington introduced herself. She didn't knock like a neighbor. She knocked like someone delivering an ultimatum. It was late Saturday morning. I had just finished stacking some fresh firewood along the side of the cabin while my wife was inside, baking her famous blueberry scones. The knock echoed sharp and hollow off the porch beams. When I opened the door, there stood a woman in her early 60s, dressed in fitted slacks, spotless white sneakers, and a collared sweatshirt with a Lakeside Preservation Committee logo embroidered on the chest. Her hair was styled in that high-volume, platinum blonde cut you'd recognize anywhere. Her expression was one of firm courtesy, the kind of smile that only goes halfway up the cheeks. "Good morning," she said, in a tone that implied it wasn't. I smiled anyway. "Morning. Can I help you?" "I'm Karen Wellington, president of the Lake Bellamy Homeowners Association. We're conducting a visual compliance review this weekend and noticed a few irregularities." She didn't wait for permission to continue. She lifted her tablet, swiped it with one manicured finger, and turned it toward me. "You have firewood stacked against an exterior wall. That's a violation of HOA Fire Code Regulation 4B. In your porch light," she glanced toward the modest lantern fixture above our front door, "appears to be unapproved. It emits a non-conforming hue." I blinked. "It's warm white. 40-watt LED. We picked it specifically because it matched the community lighting." Karen's lips curved upward, but not with warmth. "The regulation specifies HOA-approved bulbs only. And stacking firewood directly against the structure poses a pest hazard. You'll be issued a notice and a fine of $75. You'll have until next Friday to correct the violations." She handed me a printout from a folder I hadn't even seen her carrying. It was already filled out with our address and a scannable QR code at the bottom. Now, I've lived in communities with HOAs before. I know they can be both a blessing and a nightmare. But there was something else behind Karen's tone, an assumption, that we were temporary, that we were, somehow, not from here, outsiders. Still, I stayed polite. "Thanks. I'll review this with my wife." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. We expect full compliance. The HOA takes pride in maintaining community standards. You'll find that things run a certain way around here. She turned on her heel and walked down the porch steps as if she'd just closed a business deal. I closed the door behind her and sighed. My wife walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. Was that who I think it was? You mean the queen of the HOA? Yeah. She fined us $75 for light bulbs and firewood. She rolled her eyes. She's lucky she didn't catch me in my robe. I might have ruled that an assault. We both laughed, but a faint warning bell had rung in the back of my head. I'd seen this kind of behavior before, posturing from people who wield a little power like it's a sword. Karen reminded me of junior managers who act like they run the whole company because someone let them chair a meeting once. We didn't pay the fine, not out of spite. Legally, she had no standing. The HOA bylaws we received during closing clearly allowed for natural firewood storage, so long as it was neatly stacked. And the lighting? It conformed to the documented 3,000K requirement. I even checked the bulb specs and took photos. We figured that was the end of it. We were wrong. The next weekend, we returned to the cabin and found a bright orange envelope taped to our door. It was labeled Second Notice and Knowing Compliance. This time, the fine had doubled, and there was a new complaint. Exterior structure may exceed permitted neutral paint spectrum. Our cabin was stained cedar brown, like every other one in the area. Nothing had changed. That night, Karen sent us an email, copying several board members and including an itemized summary of escalating penalties. Continued disregard for community rules will result in formal action, she warned. The HOA reserves the right to refer persistent noncompliance to appropriate authorities. Still, we weren't breaking any rules. My wife, ever measured, suggested we respond with citations and photos, which we did. We never heard back until the police showed up. It was a rainy Sunday morning. We were packing up to head back to the city when two sheriff's deputies pulled into the gravel driveway. I watched from the porch as they stepped out of the cruiser, their boots crunching in the wet gravel. I met them halfway. "Morning, officers. Everything okay?" "Got a report from the HOA president," one said, glancing at his notepad. "She alleges repeated code violations, potential permit issues, and an unlicensed dwelling modification." "Unlicensed dwelling, what?" I asked, baffled. "She claims the porch has been extended without county approval. We're just here to take a statement and confirm everything's in order." My wife stepped out onto the porch, calm and collected in a navy raincoat, her hair tied back. "I assume you'd like to see our permits?" she asked evenly. The officers nodded. She walked inside, came back with a slim folder, and handed it over. Inside was every legal document related to the cabin's construction, including the permit from 1999 that approved the porch, long before we bought the place. One of the deputies reviewed the paperwork, nodded, and looked back up at her. "Thank you, ma'am. This all seems in order." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "May I ask your name, just for the report?" She smiled slightly. "Judge Olivia Carter, United States District Court, Northern District." I've never seen two officers straighten up faster. Their expressions shifted from casual inquiry to crisp professionalism. "Understood, Your Honor," the younger one said. "Apologies for the intrusion." She nodded, utterly composed. "None needed. I appreciate your thoroughness." They left within minutes, radios crackling as they walked back to the cruiser. I watched from the porch as they paused halfway down the drive, looking back at the cabin. Then they drove off, more cautiously than they had arrived. Inside, I asked, "Think that'll be the end of it?" My wife smiled. "No, that was just Karen's opening move. But she made a mistake. She escalated without understanding the rules she's playing with." I nodded slowly. She called in the law on the law. We sat in silence for a moment, the storm tapping gently against the windows. "That'll be her mistake," she added, almost to herself. "And I'm going to make sure she remembers it." After the deputies left our property and drove off in the rain, my wife turned to me, jaw tight, eyes colder than I'd seen in months. "She abused public resources to settle a personal score," she said. That one sentence changed everything. We had come here to escape bureaucracy, to live simply, quietly, and off-grid, at least off the courtroom grid. But Karen Wellington had just dragged us straight back into the very system we'd try to leave behind. And she had done so with the arrogance of someone who thought the rules didn't apply to her. That kind of arrogance was fuel. That night, we opened our laptops and began our own investigation. Not for revenge, but for clarity. We weren't the kind of people to throw our weight around. But when someone tries to weaponize rules they don't understand, it's not bullying to defend yourself. It's necessary. The first thing we did was read the entire HOA covenant line by line. That took most of the evening. Some of it was boilerplate, restrictions on paint colors, landscaping rules, garbage bin placement. But some clauses raised red flags, especially the ones with vague enforcement authority granted to the acting president of the board. Next, we reviewed the HOA meeting minutes, which, thanks to open records law, had to be posted online, albeit behind a password-protected resident portal. I registered our cabin's address, got access, and started reading. The name Karen Wellington came up in nearly every meeting summary dating back 8 years. Apparently, she had served as HOA president for 4 consecutive terms. That alone was unusual. Most associations had term limits written in. But in one 2016 meeting, a footnote mentioned that term limits were suspended via emergency vote due to a lack of leadership candidates. How convenient. Karen had also made a habit of introducing new regulations, minor at first, but increasingly specific. There were discussions about outlawing front porch hammocks, limiting firewood stack height, banning wind chimes, and even proposing a limit on the number of bird feeders per household. All these proposals had passed, usually with slim majority votes by a board made up entirely of Karen's longtime friends. But the most telling detail came when we started comparing those who were fined with those who weren't. My wife cross-referenced the violation logs with property maps, which she printed out and pinned to the cabin study wall. She used red dots to mark every property that had received 2 or more fines in the last 24 months. Then she layered on another detail: owner tenure. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The majority of the fines were issued to newer residents, people who had moved in within the past 5 years. Those who had lived here longer, particularly those in the original development phase, rarely appeared on the list. And those who were friends with Karen, their properties were pristine on paper. Looks like enforcement isn't just selective, my wife said. It's targeted. We needed boots-on-the-ground information. So the following weekend, instead of taking our usual hiking trail or sitting on the porch with books, we started walking the neighborhood. We didn't go door to door. That would have seemed too aggressive. But we lingered, waved, stopped to compliment someone's garden or fence work. We started asking subtle questions. How long have you lived here? Have you ever had trouble with the HOA? Turns out, we weren't the only ones with stories. A couple named Laura and Daniel, who lived 2 streets over in a small A-frame cabin, invited us in after we complimented their flower beds. Over mugs of herbal tea, Laura confessed they'd been fined 4 times in the past year alone for unapproved porch furniture, for a lawn that exceeded community blade length standards, and once because their Halloween decoration stayed up 3 days past the cutoff. They made it sound like we were ruining property values, Daniel said. But Karen's friend across the street has rusted lawn flamingos, and no one says a word. Down the lane, we met Mr. and Mrs. Chung, retirees who'd owned their cottage for nearly a decade. When I brought up Karen's enforcement tactics, Mr. Chung simply raised an eyebrow. She fined us for painting our shutters without approval, he said. Never mind that the color matched our neighbors. But he's been here since the beginning. No fine for him. His wife added quietly, she doesn't like change, or new people, especially if they don't fit her mold. Later that afternoon, we met Naomi, a single mother who worked nights as an ICU nurse. She invited us into her backyard, where her 3 kids were playing on a tire swing. She looked embarrassed as she told us about being fined for leaving trash bins out too long, after she'd worked a double shift. They don't care about the people, she said. Just the image. Karen wants everything to look like a magazine cover. If you're too tired, too brown, or too busy to fall in line, you're a target. Back at our cabin, my wife was quiet for a long time. She's using the HOA as a shield, she said finally. a way to impose her own preferences and prejudices under the guise of rules. It's not illegal, but it's unethical. And if we dig deep enough, it might even be unlawful. We were both starting to see it. This wasn't just about petty fines. It was a culture of control. And Karen had built herself a little empire, one vote at a time. The next day, we visited the county clerk's office to request public records related to the HOA's incorporation, financial filings, and real estate transactions connected to Karen Wellington or her known associates. We also reviewed building permit requests and easement access records. That's when things started to unravel. We found that the HOA had been issuing citations for modifications, like porch extensions or deck repairs, that had already been approved by the county. In some cases, the HOA claimed authority to override permits. That was flatly illegal. The board had also used community funds to commission multiple landscaping beautification projects, but no formal bids had been posted. All contracts had gone to the same private vendor, Greenbelt Solutions, LLC. A quick records search showed that the business was registered under the name Thomas Wellington, Karen's cousin. We dug deeper. The HOA's treasurer, Marcia Dillon, owned a second property within the neighborhood that she never disclosed during board elections, a violation of ethical conflict of interest guidelines. Her property had been exempt from recent sidewalk repairs charged to all other homes on the same block. In short, the board wasn't just bending the rules. They were writing and enforcing them selectively, favoring long-timers, silencing new residents, and using HOA fines as a weapon. Here's what I think happened, my wife said one night, spreading out documents across the dining table. Karen saw our names, saw we were new, assumed we were just weekenders with no roots here. And she thought she could use us as an example, publicly penalize us to send a message to other new buyers. Follow her rules or get out. She paused, tapping a spreadsheet that showed a 40% increase in fines issued to new residents in the last 2 years. She's running a campaign, she said. A slow, quiet purge. The more we looked, the more obvious it became that Karen was treating HOA leadership as a personal power structure. Not to protect the community, but to reshape it. The fines weren't about compliance. They were about conformity. We printed copies of everything we found, created a digital archive, and began drafting a formal complaint. First for the HOA's internal ombudsman, though we knew that would go nowhere, and then for the County Housing Authority and, eventually, the State Oversight Board for Homeowner Associations. Karen had tried to operate in the shadows. She never expected someone would pull the curtains back. And she definitely never expected one of the people she'd find to wear a black robe 5 days a week and be trained in the art of legal war. She thinks this is about property values, my wife said that night, sipping tea on our cabin porch. But it's really about accountability. And I'm done letting her hide behind bylaws she rewrote herself. We were just getting started. We didn't light torches or march in protest. That's not how you dismantle an empire like Karen's. Not in a neighborhood HOA, and certainly not when the tyrant thinks she has every system stacked in her favor. No, if you want to topple someone like Karen Wellington, you don't shout. You whisper. And that's exactly what we did. My wife began mapping out our plan the same way she prepared for trials. Meticulously, methodically, and with devastating calm. While I gathered support through quiet conversations with neighbors, she dug deep into the bylaws, the state housing code, and the HOA's articles of incorporation. Her biggest weakness, my wife said, spreading out a set of annotated documents across our dining table, is that she believes she understands the law just because no one's ever challenged her. But this, she tapped a section labeled Unauthorized Fines and Violations Process. This gives us the opening we need. According to both state regulations and the HOA's own charter, every citation issued must follow a specific process. Formal written notice, 14-day window to correct, board review, and homeowner appeal before penalties can be enforced. Karen had skipped all of that. In multiple instances, she had issued fines the same day she observed supposed violations. No board vote, no opportunity for appeal, no due process. And when those fines weren't paid, she doubled them arbitrarily or added administrative fees, not authorized anywhere in the HOA's documentation. That's not just overreach, my wife explained. It's unlawful enforcement of pseudo-government authority without due process. And if the board allowed it, they're complicit. So we got organized. Quietly. We reached out to residents. We had already spoken to Naomi, the Chungs, Daniel and Laura, and a handful of others. We didn't say too much in text or email. We kept everything face-to-face. Every few days, we'd host a small coffee or dinner gathering at our cabin under the casual guise of neighbor get-togethers. The more people we spoke to, the more stories we heard. Some of them were infuriating, others heartbreaking. One retired couple had been fined repeatedly for an unauthorized deck addition that had been on the house since the 1980s. A black family who'd moved in 2 years earlier had been cited for excessive window tinting on their front-facing windows, a violation not listed anywhere. When they tried to appeal, Karen had told them the board didn't feel their aesthetics matched the community's standards. This isn't just mismanagement, my wife told the group during one of those quiet meetings. It's targeted harassment through official channels, and we're going to prove it. She compiled the testimonies into formal affidavits, anonymized where needed. She created a database with time-stamped notices, cross-referenced fines with their lack of supporting documentation, and began tracking Karen's most consistent moves, timing, language, escalation patterns. But she didn't stop there. One evening, she asked me to drive into the city with her to meet a contact at the Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs. The contact was an old law school friend, now a senior compliance officer who specialized in community association abuse cases. Over coffee in a downtown bistro, my wife calmly laid out the evidence. By the time she was done, her friend looked stunned. "She's issuing legally binding punishments without oversight," he said. "That crosses the line from mismanagement into regulatory fraud." A week later, we received confirmation. 2 state agencies were opening inquiries. One into the HOA's enforcement procedures, the other into Karen's personal and financial ties to vendors, specifically Greenbelt Solutions, LLC, her cousin's landscaping company that had received every single HOA beautification contract for 6 years. Still, we weren't done. My wife filed an official complaint with the State Homeowners Association Oversight Board. She included supporting documentation, copies of notices, proof of misapplied fines, and interviews from affected residents. Every document was properly labeled, indexed, and sourced. It was a judicial-grade packet, an airtight case, assembled with quiet fury. We also sent a separate packet to the County Ethics Board. Karen's use of HOA resources for personal social events, catered parties, committee luncheons at her home, and vendor kickbacks aren't just unethical, my wife said. They may be prosecutable under fraud statutes. Our timing was deliberate. We waited until just before the next HOA board meeting. One Karen had called to introduce a community redevelopment initiative. We knew she'd been planning this for months. She wanted to expand HOA control to the community's greenbelt zones and initiate a special assessment to revitalize the walking trail system. In reality, she was trying to raise funds to install private lake access behind her own property, disguised as a public amenity. We let her get right to the edge of unveiling her plans. Then we moved. 3 days before the board meeting, certified letters from the state arrived at the HOA's official address, Karen's own home. They were subpoenas requesting financial records, meeting transcripts, and formal explanations for all fines issued over the last 3 years. A second set of letters arrived from the County Inspector General's office, announcing an independent audit of all HOA contracts, citing concerns of nepotism and financial mismanagement. Karen didn't see it coming. Neighbors told us she was seen that night in her front yard, pacing furiously with her phone glued to her ear. At the board meeting, she arrived visibly rattled. Her usual polished demeanor cracked around the edges. She skipped her usual opening speech and went straight into new business, but you could tell she wasn't focused. She tried to rush through the redevelopment proposal, hoping for a quick vote. Then, right on cue, Naomi stood up. "I think before we approve any new projects," she said calmly, holding up a manila envelope, "we should discuss this." She handed it to the secretary, who began reading. The air in the room changed. More envelopes followed. The Chungs, Laura and Daniel. Even Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who rarely left his porch, had written a signed statement. Each document described improper citations, due process violations, and selective enforcement under Karen's leadership. Residents began murmuring. Some gasped audibly. Karen tried to speak, but it was too late. One man near the back of the room, someone I hadn't met yet, stood up and said, "Is it true your cousin owns the landscaping company we've paid $140,000 over the last 2 years?" Karen froze. The board approved." Another voice called out. "You wrote the proposal yourself, Karen. I saw your name on the invoice memo." Whispers turned to accusations. People stood. The secretary looked uncomfortable. And just when it seemed like the meeting was about to spiral into chaos, my wife stood. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply said, "We filed formal complaints with the state and county, and subpoenas have been issued. This meeting is now a matter of public record. I suggest everyone choose their words carefully." Karen's face went pale. The room fell into stunned silence. My wife sat down without another word. Later that night, as we walked back to the cabin under the stars, she said she underestimated the one thing that would unravel her. "What's that?" I asked. "Transparency." The next week, things moved fast. The HOA's financial records were turned over. A third-party audit firm began reviewing accounts. Several suspicious payments surfaced. Charges for consulting services that had never been rendered, overinflated maintenance fees, and a communications consultant who turned out to be Karen's niece. The county launched a formal ethics inquiry. The state issued a cease and desist against all new HOA fines pending investigation. Karen tried to rally support from the board, but one by one, members began distancing themselves. 3 of them resigned within the week. Karen called an emergency vote of confidence, an old maneuver to save face. Only 19% of residents supported her. She was, for the first time in years, cornered. "I don't want to destroy her," my wife told me that weekend. "I just want the community to breathe again." And that, more than anything, is what made her so dangerous to someone like Karen. Because my wife didn't need power. She just knew how to take it away from someone who was abusing it. By the time the subpoenas landed and the audit began, Karen Wellington wasn't just rattled, she was unraveling. But even with her back against the wall, she didn't stop swinging. Her first counterattack came fast and petty. 3 violation notices taped to our cabin door in a single day. One for unauthorized decorative elements, the antique fishing sign above our porch. One for excessive foliage intrusion, a rhododendron bush growing 1 inch over the gravel. And the third, laughably, for non-compliant rainwater drainage angles, citing the natural slope of our land. It was almost impressive how fast she manufactured grievances. Karen followed it up with gossip. Quiet, strategic poison dripped through the social circles she once controlled. Suddenly, whispers floated through the neighborhood that we were litigious troublemakers, that we were trying to destroy the community, that we were part of some political scheme to dismantle traditional neighborhood values. One resident even told me that Karen had warned her that my wife had a record of disciplinary review from her federal position, a completely fabricated claim that fell apart the moment someone searched the public judiciary archives. My wife's record was clean, pristine in fact. She's not just desperate, my wife said one evening as we reviewed the latest batch of nonsense fines. She's terrified. She thinks she can win the same way she always has, with fear. But fear doesn't work on people who know how the system works. And now, more and more residents were waking up. In the following weeks, people who had once kept their heads down started joining our quiet coalition. First it was Naomi and the Chungs, then Daniel and Laura. Then the elderly Mr. Peterson, who once muttered, "I don't get involved," started forwarding emails he'd received from Karen with one-line comments like, "Thought you'd want this. Smells fishy." Even those who hadn't experienced fines directly began to see the writing on the wall. Karen's entire leadership style, based on silence, intimidation, and unilateral decisions, was being pulled apart thread by thread. And she knew it. At the next board meeting, she went on the offensive. She stood at the podium in front of a crowd that had nearly tripled in size from previous meetings, residents who'd never attended before but were suddenly very curious. With forced calm and carefully measured words, she launched into a speech filled with passive-aggressive swipes and thinly veiled accusations. "I find it deeply concerning," she said, "that certain members of our community have chosen to attack the integrity of this board rather than engage constructively. These individuals, some of whom have little history here, are determined to dismantle what we've built." She looked directly at us, though she didn't say our names. "They've filed complaints," she continued, "created division, and even weaponized the legal system against hard-working volunteers." The room stayed quiet. That's when she made her fatal mistake. "And let's be honest," she added, voice rising slightly, "some people crave attention. Titles don't make you right. Even if you're a judge, even if you're married to one." There it was. A naked attempt to discredit my wife in public. An insinuation she hoped would cast doubt or stir resentment. But instead of gasps or murmurs of agreement, the room went silent with discomfort. Then someone stood. It was Mrs. Morales, a teacher who lived on the lake's west side. She had been quiet until now. But tonight, she cleared her throat and raised her voice. "Respectfully, Ms. Wellington," she said, "we've seen the documents. We've seen the misuse of fines, the nepotism, and the private contracts. It's not about titles. It's about facts." Karen tried to speak, but the dam had cracked. Next came Mr. Chung, then Naomi. Each took a turn standing up, calmly but firmly recounting their own experiences, the fines, the dismissals, the unequal treatment. It was like watching a courtroom unfold, one honest witness after another. And Karen? She couldn't stop it. Her carefully built illusion of control was collapsing right in front of her. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Marcia Dillon, the treasurer who'd quietly resigned 2 weeks prior, stood and asked to speak. Karen's face turned ghostly white. Marcia held a stack of papers in one hand. "I've turned over everything to the audit team," she said, "and I'd like to apologize to the community for enabling this." She didn't need to say Karen's name. Everyone knew who this was. "I followed her lead for too long," Marcia continued. "But I should have stepped back when I saw her starting to approve contract to her cousin's company, using HOA funds to pay for personal landscaping at her own house, and instructing us to rush fines through without board votes." Karen lunged for the microphone. "You're lying," she hissed. "You're trying to cover your own mistakes." But Marcia didn't flinch. "Then explain the bank transfers," she said, handing papers to the board secretary. The secretary, someone Karen had appointed herself, hesitated, then opened the folder. Her face slowly dropped as she read. And just like that, the tide fully turned. A motion was raised, a formal vote to suspend Karen Wellington as acting HOA president pending the results of the state inquiry and internal audit. For the first time in 8 years, she no longer held control of the room. The vote passed. By a landslide. Karen stormed out. But she wasn't done. The following week, she launched a neighborhood-wide email campaign trying to paint herself as the victim of a political conspiracy. She claimed my wife had weaponized her position and was using government intimidation to silence dissent. But facts don't lie, and neither do court records. Within days, the first results of the county audit went public. 3 contracts issued under Karen's leadership were found to have been awarded without competitive bidding, violating county oversight regulations. 2 of those contractors were relatives. One of them, her niece, had been paid nearly $18,000 for communication consulting without any recorded deliverables. A formal disciplinary hearing was scheduled. Karen tried to dodge it, claiming harassment and legal bias. But the state board didn't budge. She was summoned to testify under oath. The hearing was held at the town hall in a packed chamber. I didn't attend, but my wife did, quietly, seated in the back. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for her. Karen stumbled through explanations, denied any knowledge of certain transactions, and tried to blame her former treasurer, until Marcia produced time-stamped emails with Karen's own digital signature approving the payments. The final nail came when the state ethics board reviewed her history of issuing fines and found clear patterns of discriminatory enforcement. The board's language was damning. They called her leadership inconsistent with fair governance and community trust. Karen wasn't just removed from the HOA presidency. She was barred from serving on any homeowners association board in the state for the next 10 years. Her reputation, once ironclad in the neighborhood, was now radioactive. Even her closest allies began resigning from the board or denying affiliation. The power structure she'd carefully built over nearly a decade collapsed in a matter of weeks. She tried to bury us in petty rules, but she got crushed by the real ones. We didn't celebrate, not in the loud, victorious way people expect. There were no balloons, no pedas, but something better happened. Naomi brought her kids by one morning to say thank you. I can finally let them ride their bikes around the lake without worrying about a noise violation, she said, hugging my wife. Mr. Peterson, the man who once never left his porch, began showing up to community meetings again. And at the next neighborhood gathering, the Chungs hosted a lakeside potluck with more families than we'd ever seen together in one place. For the first time, the community felt united, like a place we actually wanted to belong to. As for Karen, she sold her house 3 months later. The real estate agent quietly admitted she had to lower the asking price twice. No one wanted to buy a property with her name still attached to it. We didn't see her leave, but we saw what she left behind: a community learning to heal, a system being rebuilt, and neighbors learning to trust one another again. All because one woman picked the wrong porch to fine and learned that you don't try to intimidate a federal judge on her weekend off. In the weeks following Karen Wellington's official removal, the atmosphere at Lake Bellamy changed in ways you could actually feel. It was like someone had opened a window after years of stale, recycled air. The fear, the second-guessing, the quiet worry that someone might be watching your yard with a measuring tape. It all started to fade. Without Karen's looming presence and obsessive control, the community began rediscovering itself. The remaining board members, what was left of them, called for an emergency vote to restructure the HOA. This time, they didn't do it in secret or behind closed doors. They invited every homeowner. Flyers were hand-delivered. Signs were posted at the mailbox stations. For the first time in years, the HOA actually asked the community what it wanted, and the community answered. Residents flooded the meeting hall. People who had never spoken up before came with lists of concerns, ideas, and questions. It wasn't angry or chaotic. It was hopeful, energized. And in the middle of it all sat my wife, not as a judge, not as the woman who helped bring Karen down, but as a neighbor. One of the first proposals was to establish term limits, something Karen had conveniently suspended years ago. The motion passed unanimously. Then came transparency reforms, public voting records, meeting transcripts, and mandatory community-wide notices for proposed changes. No more late-night votes. No more rush fines. The HOA was finally becoming what it should have always been: representative. At the request of several neighbors, my wife was asked to help draft the community's first HOA ethics charter, a formal document outlining principles of fairness, non-discrimination, due process, and accountability. She didn't want credit for it, but the board insisted she be listed as one of its founding authors. That moment marked something important, not just the end of Karen's reign, but the start of a new era. People began opening up. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves out of fear or frustration started hosting casual gatherings again. Coffee mornings, porch chats, evening barbecues. Naomi's kids were riding bikes without incident. The Chungs planted a new garden out front, one that would have once earned them a citation for being too unruly. This time, it earned compliments. Daniel and Laura, the couple with the flower beds and too many Halloween decorations, hosted a community bonfire. We all showed up, wrapped in blankets, sipping cider, listening to the crackle of wood and the laughter of children by the lake. And for the first time since we bought the cabin, I felt like we were home. One afternoon, while raking leaves out front, I noticed Mr. Peterson, our once silent, porch-bound neighbor, walking his dog past our house. He paused, gave a slight nod, and said, "You two did good." It was the first time I'd heard his voice. A few days later, a group of residents surprised us with a gift, a hand-carved wooden sign that read, "Welcome to the Carter Cabin, justice served daily." It was corny. It was perfect. We hung it on our porch, right where Karen's first violation notice had been taped. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. We never wanted power. We never set out to lead a revolution. All we'd wanted was peace, a place to exhale, to rest, to live quietly. But peace doesn't come from keeping your head down when someone like Karen tries to control everything. Sometimes peace has to be earned, fought for, rebuilt. My wife often says justice doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it arrives in silence, when the right person simply refuses to back down. At Lake Bellamy, justice didn't just show up. She bought a cabin, rolled up her sleeves, and rewrote the rules. Sometimes the law doesn't knock. It walks in with a badge, a robe, and a memory. And when it does, it doesn't raise its voice or pound its fists. It listens. It watches. And then, when the moment is right, it moves with precision. Karen forgot that. She thought rules were weapons, not responsibilities. She used fines like threats, citations like chains, and ran our quiet lakeside community like her own private kingdom. But power used wrong always meets justice, eventually. In our case, it came from the very woman Karen tried to bully, the one she thought was just another cabin-dwelling weekend wife. A woman who just happened to wear a federal robe and know the Constitution by heart. So if you're out there watching this while trying to survive your own HOA nightmare, I want to hear your story. Drop it in the comments. Share the wildest, pettiest, most ridiculous things you've seen your neighborhood board do. You're not alone. And more importantly, you might be one document, one signature, or one smart neighbor away from turning it all around. Because here's the truth. If someone tries to bully you with rules they don't even understand, make sure they learn what the real law looks like.